All right, so in this video, we're going to talk about upstream interventions versus downstream interventions. In alcohol and drug policy, policy in general is a very upstream intervention, and you'll see why shortly. So there are multiple ways to visualize this upstream and downstream policy. The kind of classic way is the fisherman anecdote. So there's a fisherman on the side of the river. He's just kind of minding his own business, and he sees someone struggling to swim and by him. He's there. This person is drowning in the river, so he jumps in and he saves this person and he pulls him to safety. So he goes back to fishing, and he notices someone else has fallen in the river. They're drowning, so he swims in and saves them too. And he notices a third person and a fourth person, and after the fifth or sixth person, he is exhausted. He simply cannot keep doing this anymore. So he asks himself, why are there so many people drowning in the river? This is the first time he has ever seen this problem. So he starts walking upstream. Where are these people coming from? And he notices a bridge. And he notices that essentially there's this big hole in the bridge. And for whatever reason, while some people can cross the bridge safely, others tend to fall in the hole into the river and drown. So instead of him having to keep fish people out of the water, he decides to fix the bridge. He stops the problem before it even starts. And that's the idea of an upstream versus a downstream intervention. An upstream intervention fixes the bridge. It prevents the problem from even occurring. A downstream intervention is something that eliminates the problem after it already exists. So translating to public health, it is a little actually more straightforward than the anecdote. So upstream and downstream policies are similar to primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention policies, and hopefully I can make this very clear. So a tertiary prevention policy is some policy or some intervention where that tries to help someone who already had the disease, and you're really trying to prevent a reoccurrence of the disease. So if you take it a little out of, even within substance use, you have someone who is diagnosed with a dependence syndrome, a disorder. They get treatment, and now you're trying to prevent them from relapsing. So whatever policy you're putting in place to prevent the relapse, whatever program they're part of to prevent the relapse, is really a tertiary prevention policy because the thing already occurred, you're just trying to stop it from occurring again. A secondary prevention policy assumes that an individual already has a risk factor for disease, and now you're trying to prevent the disease from developing. So if we go back to our substance use disorder individual, maybe the risk factor for a substance use disorder is substance use. So now you're just trying to prevent that, one time or casual use from progressing into a disease state. And a policy and program that does that would fall under the secondary prevention category. And then finally, you have the primary prevention policies, which are trying to prevent a risk factor of disease from even forming. So in our substance use example, a primary prevention would try to promote abstinence. Don't do drugs, which doesn't necessarily work, but that's ultimately the underlying message. Don't start, because once you start, you have a risk factor for the disease. And if you have the risk factor, you're more likely to actually get the disease. And even if you can conquer the disease, you're likely to have a relapse and a reoccurrence of the disease. So tertiary focuses on people who already had the disease and you're trying to prevent relapse. Secondary prevention focuses on people who have a risk factor for disease, and now you're trying to prevent the disease from developing. It's not always substance use, but it could be environmental issues, family history, genetics. And then primary prevention is trying to prevent that risk factor, whatever it is, from even forming in the first place. Because if you can cut it off at the top, then you don't even need the secondary and tertiary prevention policies for those individuals. Now, this primary, tertiary, or secondary, tertiary idea also actually impacts the area of effect, or it corresponds to the area of effect. So a downstream policy, a tertiary prevention policy, typically has a very small effect size. You're focusing on a single disease, you're focusing on very small populations, and a lot of resources are often needed for those policies and those programs, even though the population is very small. When it comes to secondary prevention policies, you may focus on a single risk factor, but that could be related to multiple diseases. So you have an intermediate effect size because the risk factor, again, could be one or a very small thing, but if you can prevent multiple diseases from forming, then you actually have a larger public health impact. And then finally, if you have a primary prevention policy where you're focusing on environmental conditions, where you're preventing a risk factor or multiple risk factors from even forming to begin with, then you're preventing these you're both preventing these risk factors and preventing multiple diseases. So you have a very large area of effect. So as you move upstream, you end up having larger impacts on population health and often at lower costs.